This is an 8-iron, and it's a dead shank.
Wow.
Way right.
Oh, takes a hop
shank.
off the paddle.
You got to be kidding me. Very tough pitch shot right here. You got to hit it into the hill, one hop up and bite, and it's in.
Kind of like that.
Well, I would like to welcome former tour rep and golf club expert George Willett to the Sub 70 podcast. George, thanks for coming on today. Been looking forward to this conversation, ever since we got to kind of talk a little bit when we were down at the Woodlands at the Champions Tour event. So thanks for coming on.
Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I love the history of golf, the equipment, the players, golf course architecture. There's so much that you've seen over your 30 years kind of being out there. It's tough to even which direction we could go. I feel like we could talk for 3 hours, but kind of like your history, what were you doing in the golf business before you became a tour rep? Because obviously there has to be some, they just don't grab a guy off the street and say, hey, go be a tour rep for, our brand out on tour, which you work for TaylorMade. How did that come about, and what was sort of your ascension into golf to get in that position?
Well, I've always maintained that I am the luckiest person alive when it comes to how my career just kind of unfolded in front of me. I went to the San Diego Golf Academy, which is now a defunct operation out here in Rancho Santa Fe, California. And at that time would have been early 80s. Canadian dollar, I am Canadian. The Canadian dollar was about 55, 56 cents, 60 cents, somewhere in that neighborhood. So I was spending a lot of money in a short period of time. So I had heard that there's this club repair place down the road that was looking for help assembling some golf clubs and things like that. So I go and talk to this gentleman who happens to be Canadian, and him and I hit it off, and I started in the trade through this gentleman who held a small little shop in Vista, California. It was called Golf Master. Slept on his floor and learned the trade of how to make golf clubs. That gentleman happened to be a gentleman by the name of Bob Vokey. So
slightly famous.
He is now, but at that particular time, on paper, I think the IRS figured he was making about $15,000 a year, sort of thing. He drove a brand new 1963 Corvette, and we had a Datsun B210 that we'd run around and do shop deliveries and stuff like that. He was just a former electrician that fell in love with golf and started this little golf shop. And what happened was they came and got him to run the TaylorMade tour department, because one of our customers was a gentleman by the name of Lee Trevino. And Lee brought him into TaylorMade when he signed with TaylorMade. And I had the background of making and fixing all kinds of golf clubs back then. So they decided I was a good candidate to send to Europe. So I was actually working as an assistant pro in Toronto when this all came about, because I couldn't work in the States. They had tried to get me to go work for TaylorMade here in the U.S., and it wouldn't happen. But when they could send somebody to Europe, I was a perfect candidate because of the Commonwealth country. I could work over in Great Britain quite easily. So,
what did TaylorMade look like in 1988? Like the size of it, was that still in Illinois, or was it it was in California at that point, right?
It was in California in that point. I think I'm not exactly sure of the timing, but Solomon had purchased it from Gary Adams, who was basically on life support sort of thing, and they had $8 million in accounts receivable and $7 million in debt. Solomon came in and basically gave Gary a 5-year non-compete and bought his company and took it over. And basically, I think they made $29 million profit in the first year that they owned it. And I think, the number they paid for it was next to nothing, mainly because it was about to go under, and Gary Adams got his 5-year deal non-compete, and it took off from there. It was just it's one of those things where people hear you're struggling. Well, I'm not going to pay your bills if you're not going to be around in 6 months. So they were having a hard time collecting. So, and when they had Solomon come in and buy it, it just turned around that quick.
Was that in '88? Was that still the era of the old, burner driver with little dimples around the outside?
Yeah,
Am I right on that one?
Yeah, the Tour preferred the burner. Yeah, that was probably the big one. And we still had a lot of, part of my job was to carry some of the old heads, like the original Tour spoon and things like that with the screw in the bottom were actually made out of a slightly different casting, so they were extremely soft, and you could actually get some core effect from the fairway woods. That's why it worked so well. But there was a breakage issue with it because the material was so thin, and we would always have to carry a couple of those extras for guys like Curtis Strange and Lee Trevino, because that was the one that they really enjoyed using, was this original one fairway wood, which was like 12 degrees and things like that. That's where the company really started to take off out on tour.
Well, when you're asked to go to Europe, I'm sure you jumped on this. Like, what an experience. And, what was your responsibility? You take this job in Europe, you understand club building, you're learning from Mr. Vokey, who I think at that point was not a wedge designer. Like I said, he was just more of a club builder.
Well,
right?
Yeah, Bob was running the tour department for TaylorMade and doing custom clubs for the tour players and or our green grass pro staff that we were trying to encourage to use the stuff all across the country. And they've always been big on the pyramid of influence, and they realized the club pros and tour players kind of drove that for them. So we were always into the numbers at that time of trying to get the most product into play. And Bob ran the tour department. And then eventually, when Gary Adams started another company, he came and got Bob and took him over to, I think it was Founders Club and then McHenry Metals that Bob went to work for. And then he ended up with Titleist a few years later when they were looking for a wedge designer.
And then your job in Europe. So you're over there. It's the 80s. You're in Europe. Had to be a great time to be in Europe for many reasons. But, was your job custom grinding clubs for guys? What was your role in that era of from a golf equipment standpoint to work with those players when you're over there?
Yeah, I went over January of '88, and the first thing I had to do was build a repair center, because we were going to send one of the ones we had from the U.S., but it wouldn't operate under the codes over in Europe. We could get it in Great Britain, but we couldn't get it operating in Europe because we would have had to change the entire trailer. So we just decided to build one over there. So my first thing was to go down to a dealership, buy a Mercedes, it looks like a UPS truck, and then find somebody to kit out the back with a repair center. And I built it with the technicians from the ground up. It was the first one of probably, I would say, a dozen of these vehicles that I had built over the years with TaylorMade, of how to create the layout and get the proper layout so you could actually get as much stuff in one of these things as possible. I think my workspace was like 6 feet wide by 16 feet long, and now they've got one that's, I think, 48 feet long and 2-story.
Yeah, they're huge.
It's really expanded over the years for sure. They've become a showpiece. But my job was to grow the brand over there. We had a tour rep who was a tour player, but he was a fringe player, so he wasn't in all the events, but he would go to all the events. And just like in the States, they had a Harry Taylor who is a former tour player or a current tour player that had the ability to talk to the tour players because he was one of them. We did the same thing over in Europe with a guy by the name of Stuart Smith. And Stuart and I would show up at these events, and I think we had 4 staff players and about 6 or 8 drivers in play when I started. So it was really a new deal, and Mizuno was the official repair trailer of the European Tour, and technically they didn't want me on the range. They tried shooing me off for the first 6 months, and as it went on, it became more and more popular, and I got closer and closer to the range, and eventually Mizuno said it's fine, and we were able to park on the driving range with them. But Europe was so much different than any other place I had ever been. We did a lot of our work after 5 o'clock. In the summers, especially in Scotland when the sun was up till 10 o'clock, I'd have a case of beer and some wine underneath the trailer, and guys would be hitting golf balls, and we'd sit there and have a couple of pops and talk about it. And basically, when I left in April of '89, we went to 82 drivers in play out of a field of 144. So we went from 8 drivers to about 82 in the space of about 18 months. So it was an extremely quick growth period. So we were building hundreds of clubs a week, trying to keep up with the demand. My first customer, we were in the south of France. I got Ballesteros had showed up from Augusta to play in a Monday Pro-Am. He came in a red eye, and he was supposed to play on Monday with the sponsors, and his clubs didn't make it. So my first customer was making an entire set of golf clubs for Seve so he could tee off at noon.
Oh, no pressure there.
No. So, I looked at my boss and I says, I guess it's downhill from here. My idol and the number one player in my mind in the world at that particular time was your first customer. So it was kind of fun to start that way.
How was he to work with equipment-wise? I mean, I'm guessing there's a lot of feel from him. Did you have to, if you're building a set of irons, are you custom grinding soles, or is he saying, hey, take a little of this off, a little of that off, let me go hit this 5-iron? Would he go club by club to kind of get that right feel that he wanted? What was his process?
He would do, like you said, he'd do everything by eye. Obviously we didn't have time to do that in this case. I had to get him a set of golf clubs in a couple hours to go play. But as we went through and did things for him over the years, he would get a Sharpie and basically create shadows on the golf club of where he wanted it shaved or turned, or did the different things with rat tail files to try and get a curve the way he wanted it, or a top line that was flat and things like that. If you were really getting into it with him, but he hated machines. He didn't like a Lion Loft machine. He did it all by eye. You got to remember back then, all the iron heads were basically hand drilled. In a drill press, and you put them in a little crooked, it might sit a little off. And he'd do it by eye. Your numbers would say one thing, but he says, no, it's too flat. Just bring it more upright. And he did it all by eye. And
would he do it by ball flight too, or would he just do it by? He could tell from eye what the ball would then do.
I think he had an idea when he came in what he needed to do, and then he'd say, un poquito, a little bit more here, a little bit more there, and for the Lion Loft to bend him where he wanted to. He didn't really ever ask me what the number was. He would tell me I need a little bit more up or a little bit stronger, things like that. When he walked into the trailer, he knew exactly what he wanted from hitting the golf clubs previously, or he wouldn't, you'd get him to a general area and then he'd take it one by one all the way through. He was one of the first guys that taught me that each golf club has its purpose. You've got a set of irons, and at that time, everybody was buying like a set of woods. And you bought the 1, 3, 5 woods, and you bought the 3 through pitching wedge in the irons. And he basically told me, gentlemen like him, and I guess Tom Lehman reinforced that, and so did Bernard Langer and some of the others that would carry. You'd look at their irons and you think, well, this is crazy. You got, like, Langer had a Hogan 3 and 4 iron, and then some Adams irons, and then some TaylorMade wedges, and different things like that. But Tom Lehman had 4 different sets of TaylorMades and a set of 8 irons. But he wanted each particular club to go a certain distance at a certain trajectory, and he would find different ways to accomplish that. It didn't have to be all part of one set.
I say that all the time. It doesn't all have to match. You might need a little love here and a little help there, and it's okay to go out thinking outside the box to make that work for your game.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And those are that's what I find the great players find what works for them, and forget the rules. There are no rules. It has to do what it has to do.
What was Seve like if you went out to dinner with him? Like, just as you got to know him as a friend, away from the golf course, what was he like as just a human being? He's such an icon, right? Everything. I mean, it's hard for me not to think of him as this hero, fist pumping on St. Andrews, green in '84, right? But what was he just like as a person, having dinner at a cafe with him?
I was very fortunate to get taken out by these gentlemen the entire time I was in Europe. Like, one time we were down in the south of Spain. I think it was Catalonia, and Seve says, "Come to dinner tonight," and he gave me directions. And it was at somebody's house, a big mansion on the ocean sort of thing. And there was 15 of us, and they were all the Spanish-speaking players. I don't speak a lick of Spanish, but Vicente Fernandez, who's from I think Argentina, sat next to me and would translate back and forth. But very generous, they were wonderful people, all of them. Seve was he had a wonderful warmth to him and smile, and he just an incredible individual with his time. But unfortunately, he was torn in so many different directions. I don't think I ever saw him in a restaurant in the year and a half I was there. It was all private dinners and things like that because he just couldn't go anywhere.
It was just too crazy. He just couldn't enjoy himself. It just turned into a circus.
Yeah, and so he would find I gather restaurants with private rooms or local people that he had met that invited him over and wanted to entertain him. So it was, it was the only time I had dinner with Seve, was in that group kind of format. And he brought me and he brought the guys in the physio trailer, which were brand new too, that worked on his, stretching and things like that would help him out. But it was a crazy time, really.
Well, it had to be a lot of fun too, right? The people who listen to this podcast probably ad nauseum with, but I loved that era of European, and we talked about the European tour and the golfers and the personalities and the different golf swings. And as an American golf fan, like, you didn't see them play that much, right? So when they did come over for a major or the Ryder Cup did happen, these guys were like 12 rock stars coming that, in that era, those guys were so good. If we're talking Torrance, Woosnam, Faraday, Faldo, I'm thinking Monty, Ali, Langer, right? I mean, that tour was deep, and you just didn't get, we didn't have the European or DP World Tour on the Golf Channel. You just didn't get to see them play that much.
No,
so
the top 10 guys over there, the top 10 guys over there were as good as anybody in the world. There's no question about it. But they were all, it was a different sort. Like, when I went to Europe, there was two travel groups. You either stayed with Foxy, who I did, or this other group, and they handled all of your travel. They would have, you missed a cut, like on Friday night, they'd have tickets for you to fly back to London. Everybody used London as a home base. I would say the majority did anyway, and British Airways would just go back and forth. But you would stay in these huge hotels with the lobby bars, and that's how I did some of my best work. Is I'd go down to the lobby bar, and there'd be 8 or 10 or 12 guys sitting there having a beer 6, 8 o'clock at night, because you didn't go out for dinner till, if you were in Spain, you didn't go to dinner till 10:30. So in a lot of cases, we go to the lobby bar, have a couple of drinks, and then one of the English guys would get up and says, "I'm going for pizza, who's coming with me?" sort of thing. So you'd get 5 or 6 guys to go. You were together with these guys 24 hours a day when you were on site. So there was a definite camaraderie amongst the players. And then when I came to the States in '89, there was 100 hotels that you could stay at. So they spread out and you never saw anybody. They didn't even have breakfast at the same tables in player dining. Whereas in Europe, everybody was always together. And, Colin Montgomery was a rookie in '88 sort of thing. He was just an up-and-coming guy. Faldo, I took the trailer to his house on a couple of occasions and park it in his driveway and work on his stuff in the off weeks. It was just a close-knit group of guys. Faldo's one of the funniest dudes I had ever met in my entire life. And now that he's doing, some more things outside of the TV where he was always serious, or he would never show weakness amongst other players type of thing. But man, he had some limericks and dirty jokes and stuff like that was just so funny that it was contrary to the image that he had on the golf course and on TV. And so for 25 years, I'm telling the secret sort of thing that Faldo's a good guy, but nobody understood it or, agreed with me because of the persona he put on when he was on TV. He never wanted to show weakness. So,
but if you're at his house on Tuesday, he's actually a good dude.
No, he's a great dude.
Yeah.
Great dude.
Yeah.
So
one of my favorites, Sam Torrance, right? I mean, legend, 21, European Tour wins, the Ryder Cup. He's a Ryder Cup hero. I know I shouldn't root for him, but it is what it is. He's great. He had to be so much fun to have a couple cocktails with at a bar. I know I was talking to some of the European Tour players, like Sam, even if he was, Friday night, even if he's in contention on Saturday, not that he's going to go out late or anything, but he's still going to have a couple beers with the guys and hang out a little bit. Like, that's just what he did. And he had to be a great guy to get to know as well, right? Just total legend.
No question. Sammy wasn't afraid to go to the bar and have a couple of pops with the guys, but it was all about being around the guys. Later in the week, I had always been gone, so I was there Monday through Thursday to work the events, and I would probably take off Friday morning to get to the next event. So I didn't see a lot of the stuff afterwards. But the Volvo Masters down in the south of Spain, I stayed for the entire week and tore it up on a couple of occasions because it was a year end. And I'm walking home one night and the sun's coming up and Sam's out in his balcony having a cup of coffee with his wife, and he starts laughing at me from about 50 yards away. And he's just laughing at me the whole time. And he had been with us the night before at the bar called La Duquesa, or in La Duquesa. It was a Ryder bar. And they had all the Ryder Cup stuff on the side of the walls. And he was a big golf fan at this resort. And he had been with us, and I was just finally coming home when the sun was coming up, and he giggled the entire time and invited me up and had a cup of coffee with him before he went to go play. But Sam was one of those characters that he always had a story to tell. But one thing you didn't want to do is if he was playing pool, you'd watch. Don't play against him. One of the greatest pool players one of the best in the world, and nobody knew about it, but he was unbelievable. I can remember hearing stories about him playing against the world champion, the Canadian, Thornbury, I believe his name was, or something like that. And he'd give him all he could handle. So, it's just, and Sam would
what do you call that? Elite hand-eye coordination, 2 levels, right?
Wasted childhood, it takes a lot of practice time, to be good at golf and good at pool. So obviously he had the steady nerves to be able to do it. And you take a look at Sam's schedule, he was an interesting character. If it was a Ryder Cup year, I think he played every week. And if it wasn't a Ryder Cup year, he would play the minimum events and do a lot of his corporate stuff in those off years. But the Ryder Cup was so important to him that he had to go get points, and he would play every event year in a Ryder Cup year to try and position himself to be on the team. So,
were you also basically required to be at every event? So essentially, was tailor-made at every single event during that season?
Yes, it was.
That's a lot on the road. Wow.
Well, Europe's small. In a lot of cases, I'd be in like Portugal, and then I had to be in Germany. Well, people say, well, that's a long way to go. And it looks like it's a long way. It's like 800 miles. It's really not that big a deal. I mean, I got stuck on a ferry in Ireland once and had to get to the south of France. And I was running a little bit late. Usually I like to be there on the Saturday, set up Sunday, and then the players would arrive at different times on Monday. But I didn't get on the ferry out of Ireland until like Sunday morning. And I got across the ferry from Dublin over to somewhere in north of Scotland, drove to the south of England, got on another ferry, got across, and then drove to the south of France all in a day. And people say, well, that's impossible. I said, it's really not that far. It took me like 14 hours. But,
you're right. Like when I was in Scotland this fall, right, it's like you forget how small it is. Like you can get from the south of it to the north, which I think has got to be, 12 hours or something. We're here in the States or the size of Canada. I'm like, no, it's like a, 3-hour drive. I'm like, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
What?
Well,
it's got to be huge and not that big, to be honest.
Here's a stat for you. Do you know the farthest point inland in any spot in Great Britain is 72 miles to the ocean? You're within 72 miles at the farthest point anywhere in Great Britain.
That's crazy. I would have bet it's got to be 300 miles or something, right?
It's 72 miles to water.
Yeah, it's not that big. I was going to ask you too, a couple of the other players who I just love woozing them. Any good Woozy stories from equipment or just once again getting to know him as a human?
Woozy was my kind of guy. Him and I got along fantastic with my mentality growing up playing hockey and things like that. He loved the caddies, loved to go hang out and have a few beers with the caddies. I can remember one night being in like this rough bar with caddies, and there was a couple of players, and Woozy had a few drinks in him and decided he wanted to fight. And you wanted to make sure you were on his side. Because,
he's tough, right?
Oh no, I watched him mop the floor with a few guys. He was just, and this is when he was young, and he was not afraid. And I guess the Europeans or like Canadians sort of thing, they fought in a lot of cases because it was fun. It was a form of entertainment. I mean, when I grew up in a small town in Northern Ontario, and that's what I mean by lucky. If you find out where I was from, and now spent 30 years in the golf business, well, you go, how did that happen, sort of thing. But if you went out on a Friday or Saturday night, didn't get in a fight, you weren't in, you're out with the ladies, sort of thing, because you'd fight your best friend, sort of thing, if you had enough whiskey in you. It was crazy. But you'd get up and have a beer. Whereas here in the States, somebody would ask you, you want to go? Well, if you were in Europe and Canada, it's too late. You're swinging before you ask, sort of thing, or you've lost the fight. It was just the way we grew up.
Well, and he also had to be super strong, right? I mean, he was just built like a bowling ball, right? Just huge forearms, thick, naturally strong. I wouldn't want to fight a guy like that. Low center of gravity. Man, if he got you close,
huge
you'd be
lats,
hurting.
wide across the back, and he would turn his back to the target and swing through, sort of thing. So it wasn't a real long golf swing, but it was all power.
Yeah. I mean, for not a lot of height, he created a lot of power. You can just tell he was that strong. Like I said, I wouldn't want to get into a bar fight with that guy if he got a hand on you.
No, there was a couple guys that you didn't want to mess with, and I think he would be one of them. And Fulton Allen was another guy that, as kind and as sweet as he was just sinew and gristle. He could kind of scare you where he was so very, very strong. It was kind of spooky.
Another guy I think that doesn't get credit for as good of a player as he was, because he makes it out that he was terrible. Obviously, he wasn't. David Faraday, right? Like, he could really play in his day. Did you get to spend some time with David on the European tour? Because that was kind of the years he was in his prime as well as a player.
Well, he was him and Ronan Rafferty were from the Irish area, and they were fantastic to be around. Very, very good players. I don't know why David ever thought he wasn't any good, like part of his humor or whatever, but he was one of the best ball strikers there was. I think he was absolutely fantastic. I'm not sure he enjoyed it too much because with the pressures and demons that people get from one thing or another, I couldn't tell you, but he had some problems with the alcohol and things like that, and I think he decided to get away from it as much as possible. But he's a very, very intelligent man. I think he's up there with the geniuses of the world, sort of thing. Very, very, very intelligent, very quick-witted, and he, from what I understand, what I had heard, he's a classically trained opera singer as well.
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah.
So he's a man of the arts. On top. It doesn't surprise me. You can tell there's. You can see his intellect quite easily just listening to him speak, right? He seems to know a lot about a lot of subjects, and you can tell there's a lot going on up there.
Yeah. Well, one thing I noticed, everybody used to enjoy a guy like Gary McCord and how he would speak, but Gary was far more prepared than anybody I'd ever seen. He would have 3 laptops set up, one being with a list of one-liners that he might be able to work into the conversation at some point over that production. Had him sitting there waiting. He was prepared. He even pumped in sounds like the birds that were tweeting and things like that to give the ambiance that he was in the booths. But I remember, I think he got in trouble one year. He's piping in this bird, and the bird didn't live anywhere in the region, and somebody called him out on it. But so it's
also another. Yeah, he knew what he was doing, but also a better player than he gives himself credit for as well. Those guys have that in common, right? I mean, Gary was on the PGA Tour for 20 years or whatever. You can't fake that.
No,
15 years. How long he was out there? He could play golf.
Yes, there was no question he could play golf, and he didn't happen to win on the PGA. He had a license plate on his little Mercedes that said no wins.
But yeah, they won the Champions Tour and won a couple. He sells himself short. He was a really good player for a long period of time, right? But he made a great horse and pony show out of being I was terrible.
Yeah, exactly. And he was a very intelligent guy and knew how to market himself and do things like that. Whereas Faraday is very intelligent, but a lot of his stuff is off the cuff. You know, he didn't really, because he's out walking the golf course, he couldn't prepare the way McCord did with the different laptops he'd have in front of him. But it was enjoyable to see or be around those kind of characters. I spent some late nights with David in a piano bar, and when he'd start ripping it up and start singing, and it was some fun times.
What was a young Monty like? Was it still the rabbit ears and the intensity, or was he a little different when he was first out there?
He has mellowed so much compared to his rookie year. He lost 5 tournaments in his rookie year, 1988, where he threw him out going down the stretch. He would make a mistake, make a bogey, make a double, and as it was put to me in later years by a different player, he says he threw his rattle out of the crib on several occasions where he'd just kind of melt down and act like a baby and do whatever. And he has matured from that. But he would turn this crimson red.
I'm laughing and I can picture it, right? The whole face just...
And you wouldn't... I didn't have much contact with him and didn't, because we just... back then he was with Wilson. And he would, there was Mizuno on tour and TaylorMade on tour, so if he needed some help, we'd do some stuff with him. But I really, he just, I don't know if it was insecurities or what it was, but just being a young guy where I'd watch him blow up and things like that, I would give him a wide berth. I just wanted to hang around the guys that were a lot of fun to be around. But now in later years on the Champions Tour, when I was working with him, you wouldn't think it's the same guy.
The guys, they love him out there now.
He's absolutely unbelievable how nice he is. But,
who was I was talking to, a Champions Tour player that does like to still irritate him about a noise or something? God, who was I talking to? Gosh, who was it? Where it's like they almost try to get him riled up a little bit still about, did you see that Marshall or just see something over there? Because you can still get him a little rattled, but it's not like it used to be. So they said that he's still like somewhat fun to irritate a little bit.
Well, he understands how easily he was rattled before. And there'll be, even at some of the places that, if the Champions Tour got to play in New York, they would call him out. They won't forget. So if he showed up at an event in New York, I'm sure you'll hear about it, sort of thing. But, he is just a wonderful guy. And he loves to travel, loves to get in his car. I don't know if he doesn't like to fly. Obviously, he's flown a lot. But he's taken this opportunity in the Champions Tour to see the country. He drives from event to event.
Drives everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah, and he's always like showing pictures of him in these national parks and like I said, I think the American fan base now loves Monty. I think they like to irritate him just a little bit, but now it's out of respect. Like, he's been so great for so long, and he does have such a great personality that I remember in his heyday, I was like, I don't like that guy with the Ryder Cups and everything. Now it's like, as he got later in his career, I like Monty. Like, I dig Monty. Like, now he's just lasted long enough and he's mellowed out a little bit that people, I think, in the States at least root for him now. They like him.
Well, there's been a couple of different errors, and obviously Greg Norman with a persimmon wood is probably the greatest driver of the golf ball we had ever seen with a persimmon. And then the field kind of got equalized with metalwoods. But I would put Colin Montgomery probably in the top 3 all-time drivers with a metalwood in his heyday. He could drive the eyes off it. He just was so straight, always played that little buttercut fade, and knew what he could do with it. He didn't try and draw the ball or do different things. He would just play his game. And I swear, he's one of the greatest drivers of the golf ball I had ever seen. And he was playing Callaway. So for me, that was like the devil.
And he was long enough. It had to be, right? You don't win that many orders of merit, or he could pound it if he needed to back in his day.
Exactly, but he didn't have to make so many birdies because he wasn't making bogeys.
Yeah, so he just picked his spots, essentially.
Yeah, it was like Annika. Annika did, she was going to make 4 or 5 birdies around and maybe 1 bogey. Catch me in 4 days when I'm 4 under par. Go ahead, try. And that's what Colin did. He just wore them out.
Yeah, he you don't have that level of greatness for what he accomplished on that run without having every facet of your game, right? Then he must have figured out the mental side. He had the physical side. He had the touch. He had to be long enough. You can't win. What did he win? 8 or 9 orders of merit? Like, it's in a row?
I think it was 7 in a row to 8 overall.
That's right in a career. That's
yeah.
And you know what the competition was. You were over there with the competition. Even the '90s was over there.
Yeah. And well, you saw in the U.S. what I saw in his rookie year or two when he was starting out in his temper tantrum and the rabbit ears and all the rest. When it got ratcheted up and he came over and played in the majors, obviously he was fine-tuned. Everything was going on around him. He couldn't block it out. And he would have a few meltdowns out on the golf course, and that's why the U.S. crowd kind of went at him a little bit. But he was always, since then he's been absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, gotta love Monty. I'm going to ask you more on the equipment side. So, you started off with an era. There's no TrackMan, there's no GC quads. You had to kind of go, I'm old enough where I remember still fitting golf clubs. And if it was outside on a range, you could still tell by the ball flight what's going on. And, do we kind of have it dialed in, right? You could still see it.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say it was harder back then to fit the equipment with the variances and the balls not being as consistent? Or as you went on with your career, without having as many different maybe tools or the guys having the expertise of how to, get the exact grind they want, was it more difficult as the clubs became more, that's what I'm trying to use, neutral or less unique, than the stuff from the 80s where you really had some unique grinds on irons and wedges and stuff you could do where it seems like a lot of that era player could really just kind of find it out of the ground like we were talking about earlier. So I guess my long-winded question was, did it get easier or harder as the equipment essentially got more consistent and the ball got better?
Well, for instance, Lee Trevino, one of the first times I worked with him on a site was at 1988 at the British Open. He shows up, and I'm standing in the back of the trailer, and he's on the ground, and he's got his 50 people following him around, and he starts holding court and chatting, and I'm the guy that does all his club repair. And I looked down, and all of the ferrules were melted off his clubs. He had reset the shafts the night before in the hotel room. So what I mean to say by that is a lot of the guys did the work on their own because that's what they had to, and they found it, and they could work it with what they'd got. I was doing lie and loss for Craig Stadler once, and I said, your 4-iron's 2 degrees more upright than everything else. I said, do you want me to put it in line? He says, no. He says, if I need to hook something, I hit that 4-iron. So they knew how their golf clubs operated and weren't worried with the minutia. And then we started getting into the age where we had some technology. I had a digital swing weight scale that would basically, it was a gram weight scale where you could measure the weights of grips and ferrules. And I would have guys come in and separate the grips. They all had to be 50 grams or 50.1 grams or, and do that. And he would even, John Mahaffey would separate the ferrules. So all of the ferrules weighed exactly the same amount. And then swing weights would be D3.4, not D3.5. We needed them at D3.4. I threw that machine away. I said, that's got to go because we're not going to get into that kind of minutia. And then you start with the frequency and everything else. But now you see the players come in, you'll give them, you might ship them 50 drivers to their house with different combinations of shafts and things like that. And they'll find what they've got and then they'll bring it in. But they'll test everything on the TrackMan and then they take it out to the golf course. Or you give them something on the golf course.
Is that good or bad, or does it get one-dimensional then if you're just relying on the TrackMan only versus playing golf?
I think it hurts because you lose the artistry of it. Golf clubs have gotten disposable. Like Justin Thomas giving away his wedge this week. Are you kidding me? Back in the day, you'd hold on to a wedge that worked for you for months, if not years. He'd just give it to some kid because he had a scratch on the sole. He had a rock in a bunker. And I'm going, wow. It's golf clubs have become, because the trailers are out there and we've got manufacturers that can ship stuff overnight and get it to you the next day. And we've turned these golf clubs into disposable objects sort of thing. Whereas, if you remember back in the day, Larry Nelson was talking to his wife about getting a new driver. And she says, well, I haven't had a new dress in 2 years, and this is your third driver this year. She says, maybe you need to go practice more.
Yeah, it's changed. I mean, we see it with wedges a lot with our tour guys of like, I think they want new grooves quite often. We're changing out wedges 4 or 5 times a year at this point.
Yeah, well,
for our little staff that we have.
Yeah, it was like Mark O'Mara was one of our best staff player for years at TaylorMade. He was our flagship, our horse, and I had him on a maintenance schedule. Every 5 weeks that he had, regardless of whether he played or not, we would change the grips, do the lies and lofts, and check everything out. And now, basically, since that time, 98, that worked well, and then he ended up leaving us in about 2000. And from what I understand, he got new golf clubs every 5 weeks. The entire set of irons and woods, the whole bit, rather than working with these guys for the year. We spend the off season getting ready for the new year, and those are the clubs you play for at least that year. And
well,
then
that seems strange with an iron because they're all a little bit different, right? Like,
no,
I own a golf club company, and I'll play irons for years if once I get them exactly where I want them.
Yeah.
Wedges I might change a little bit more, maybe once a year for me, but irons, once it's doing what I want it to do it, I don't like messing with it too much.
VJ started it. He basically put in new wedges at every major championship. That was, the week before. So you would have fresh grooves for the majors. And then, with O'Mara being every 5 weeks of maintenance and things like that, we had schedules for these guys of basically what they needed. And then other guys, Tom Weiskopf, what did he play? 30 years on tour?
Yeah, thereabouts.
He used 2 sets of irons in those 30 years.
I have a good story. I was in high school, then early 91. I was watching Weiskopf at a Champions Tour event in Aurora, Illinois. He's got this old brown leather bag with these Wilson, I think maybe it was some Wilson blades, if I remember right. He's about a foot taller than everybody else. I just sat there mesmerized at the sound of the impact. He was in his early 50s, so he still had it. It just sounded different, looked different, went twice as high. Mm-hmm. And the swing was just this thing of power and grace in one motion. I remember just sitting there watching him hit balls for like 40 minutes. Like, whatever that guy's got, my goodness, if I could ever make a golf ball sound and do what he did. The talent was insane. And he's, hitting balls next to other tour players, and that's how much better it was.
Yeah, he was, that's almost a prototype for tour players now for size. Whereas back then, he was an anomaly because it was hard to get golf clubs that would fit. Nobody used longer golf clubs. Like Phil Blackmar used to do a lot of club repairing. You don't realize how big that man is until you get up next to him and you realize
like
he's
6'6" or something, right?
I think it's closer to 6'8".
That's a big boy.
Yeah. And he was a long drive guy, too, and he used to just put extensions in his clubs and do different things like that. But back when I started, a lot of these guys did their own work, or they didn't do any work at all. They'd just take them off the rack and away they would go, whatever they sent them, and learn how to play. But now everything's down to the minutia that the clubs have to be perfect, and then they're, if it doesn't work out, it's still the golf club's fault. There's no artistry, as far as I can see yet, left. It's just hit it as hard as you can, gouge it out, hit a wedge, make some putts. So there's no Lee Trevino's left. There's no the tour is going to miss guys like Zach Johnson and Mike Weir, the little banjo hitters.
That's going away. That's just going to go away. They can't compete anymore.
It's basically gone. So
yeah. Over the long haul, the math proves that if you're 6'3" and can hit it that far, no one's going to win the Masters again by laying up on every par 5. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, so
it's a different game. Who had some of the best natural feel? In other words, like you could give him a club, the guys you worked with, and he could go swing weight slightly off or ask for changes, and he was right.
Mr.
He was
Aoki.
right of like how. Really?
Sayo Aoki, without question. Probably had the best set of hands I'd ever seen with that sort of. He could tell a half swing weight.
He could tell a half a swing weight?
Yeah. I tested him on a couple of occasions, and he'd laugh at me. Nice man, wonderful man, but I'll tell you what, he had a set of hands on him.
Well, he played the golf like he had a set of hands on him, didn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, what he could do with wedges and irons, and I mean, there was a lot of hand action in that golf swing.
Yeah, but he's one of those characters that a lot of people didn't think he could speak English, because he was always so quiet or whatever. Always had an interpreter, and I think that was a bit of a protection thing. But if you got him and went to dinner with him, had a glass of wine or two, and he could speak English as good as I could, but very, very quietly.
And he could tell the same thing with just swing weight or extra wrap of tape in the wrong spot, shaft flex.
Yeah, no, he could figure it. He knew exactly what he wanted and how to achieve it. So, yeah.
And Hale Irwin was pretty good at it too, right? Of getting that equipment just by feel dialed in as well. Pretty much really good at getting his stuff set up for him the way he wanted it.
Hale is one of the best that I've ever seen at a lot of different things, but his competitive fire was what made him great. I mean, he didn't hit it far compared to a lot of guys, but he was a mechanic. He knew how to get around the golf course. And I can remember one day we're working out in the Kingdom, and he comes in and I set up a TrackMan. He says, "What do you need that for?" I says, "Well, it's for us to, check yardages and distances and stuff like that." So he warmed up and got in front of it, and he says, "Okay, let's do this as an experiment." And it's a 7-iron. Looks at the trajectory and he says, "That's 142." Right on the number. He knew by looking at it in the air how far it was going to go and do different things. And then when we would take him inside and put him on the putting machine, we had a mat system that would track your stroke and your path and whether it was up or down, inside, out, face angle, the whole bit. It was quite a miraculous system and state-of-the-art at the time. And he and Retief Goosen were probably had the most spin on their natural putting stroke I'd ever seen. So they hit it in such a way where the ball would come off checking.
That's weird because they putted it really well. Normally,
and
I
I
try to get it rolling, right?
Yeah, and I told Hale, I said, "What do you do differently? Say you're in Hawaii, you play great in Bermuda grass. What do you do when you've got an uphill putt and it's into the grain?" So he brushes it, and all of a sudden his backspin went from -70 to plus 140. He knew how to putt in those conditions. But what it makes you understand is when they get on extremely fast U.S. Open golf courses and they've got that downhill slider, they've got that little putt that checks and then trickles out. They could hit it. They actually spun their putts enough where they could control it, and then it would be like a delayed release and be able to be really good on the Shinnecocks or Medinas where they were downhill slippery putts. They were so much better than everybody else because they could actually check it, and it would just kind of
Goosen do the same thing?
Yes.
Could he switch the putting stroke around, too, if he had to go uphill under Bermuda, no problem?
Not as well, but it was always he always putted great in U.S. Opens when they were extremely fast.
Both of those guys.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, it makes sense then, right? Then all of a sudden you probably saw that and go, oh, okay. There's an inherent advantage, right?
Yeah.
When those, especially from that era, when those guys were playing it, when the golf courses were literally on the edge, which seemed to be getting it out of a little bit at this point. I was going to ask you, too, about, I think it's interesting, like for the era that you went from to where you ended at TaylorMade, in TaylorMade, you think of TaylorMade with drivers, graphite shafts. How did that transition go where the players, could really start trusting pulling steel into graphite? And what was some of the seminal moments in it? Was it, the HM40, then the Pro Force, and then an EI7? Like, where did that really get to the point where the shafts got good enough for those players to pull steel out? And how long did that, you guys probably saw as a manufacturer, this is a little bit of a better mousetrap, but how did that transition go? And what were sort of the big moments in that of getting that technology to really work for the best players in the world?
Well, I think the first one would have been the TaylorMade Tour Gold, which was the Aldila HM40 shaft. We had an exclusivity to it and painted it gold, and so it would stand out market-wise, sort of thing. But it was pretty decent, and that's where the numbers with the graphite, because we can go a little bit longer with the same head weight, get a little bit more speed, and still have the control. because it was overall weight. But it really, the next one was the HM55, which was what we called the flex twist.
I remember that one. Yeah, it was like
93. That was the black and gray one.
Yep.
That's when they started to really get an idea of how to do it. You know, previous to that, we had graphite shafts that had 3.5, 4 degrees torque. And then they were able to reduce the torque on the HM55 to, I think it was 1.8, 2.
Oh, that's a tight shaft. Yeah.
And that was the first one that, you know, where you used to get a lot of the flex from the tip of the shaft, and that's where the launch came from, and that's where the inaccuracy come. And then they were able, when they were able to stiffen up the tip, they were able to go to mid-flex or butt-flex to try and control the flight trajectories, but they had to make it stiff enough and get it to operate before they could get that far. But I think those are the two that really took off. And then we had, I think Fujikura came to TaylorMade, and they started making the shape shaft, the bubble shaft for us back in the day. And that's when we started messing with weights. You know, a lot of people said, you know, why the shape? Well, the shape was there as a marketing campaign, but it originated when we tried to get, I think it was 10, 15 grams of weight out of the shaft and put it just below the grip.
Yep.
And that bubble came, there was, the original stuff had a brass ring up there, and it looked spectacular. It was a black shaft with this brass ring. In fact, that's what Alothable won the Masters with, was a prototype head with that shaft in it. But we could never market it, or, you know, because he was with Mormon at the time. We couldn't tell anybody about it, really. It was a different color. It was a silver head instead of, you know, we had eventually made it, it was one of the first orange ones with Fire Soul, but it was the prototype head that I don't know if it really ever sold much of them on market, because it was just there for a short period of time as a transition to something else. But that, when they started messing with the weights in the shafts, and now they've got a lot of counterbalance stuff, you know, when you can take weight out of a club and move it where you want, you can increase speed or control or trajectory or things like that. So that's the precursor to where we are now, is a lot of stuff like that. And people, you know, and then the shape shaft went away. To this day, I'm not real convinced that it was a good idea with that huge butt, and we had to do specific grips for that bubble shaft. And it was all about reducing.
I remember gripping those things back when I was in college. They were brutal. We had one grip that would work for it.
Yeah, well, we had to produce, you know, our own grips for it. And, you know, a lot of people got sick and tired. Well, what do you do now if you've got an old set of bubble iron shafts out there and you need new grips? I mean, they don't exist. You're done.
Right.
So.
Right. Was the Proforce a big change when that one came out too? That yellow and purple one from UST?
That was a shaft that Titleist used pretty much exclusively. And they had an agreement with UST, and we didn't use a whole lot of it until that agreement kind of went away and we were allowed to put it in some of our stuff. But it was never really a factor with TaylorMade stuff, no.
I remember there was a lot of, you know, that in the EI-70. I'm just trying to think of the old classics that really kind of changed. You know, they got a lot better in that 10-year period, right? I don't, you know, you take our last 10 years. I don't know if they're probably not as much better as it was from the last 10 years. From, you know, you take graphite shafts from, you know, 1990 to 2000. There's a lot of improvement in them.
Yeah, well, we had agreements with proprietary shaft manufacturers where we would buy a certain amount from them and they couldn't sell it to anybody else. And UST and EI-70 were basically in bed with Titleist because we had Fujikura and Aldila. So those two shafts you're talking about had a lot of success. There's no question about it, especially in aftermarket stuff, because you could buy that shaft aftermarket. But you couldn't necessarily buy a lot of the Fujikura stuff that we had. You had to buy it all in one piece.
A little bit of an arms race with you guys back in the day of manufacturers. Now it's not as exclusive, right? I mean, everyone kind of has all of the options. Exactly.
I don't think there is that type of...
No. You know, like we have access to everything, right? I mean, 'cause that's just kind of the way the market's gone. We have to have every major brand because some people want a Ventus and some want a hazardous smoke, right? You have to have everything at this point.
Correct.
Even a smaller company like ours has access. There's no cutting us off even. So I know all the big boys have. Basically, you can get any shaft you want, and they'll be happy to work with you anymore.
Yeah.
Well, one last question. Because it's a sub 70 podcast, we have to ask Tommy Armour III, our guy. Back when you met him over in Europe, hanging out a little bit, what was TA like? We obviously know him today quite well, both you and I, and he's helped us so much. He's been a mentor to me, and it's cool when one of your heroes becomes a friend, and he really has been. But what was a young TA over in Europe and playing golf around the world like when you first met him?
Well, I don't think Tommy's changed so much. His reputation is, for one thing, but I've always known Tommy to be really low key, kind of in the background. He's been there for all of these major events, and he's that fixture that's on the wall sort of stuff. He's never really ever the one that's driving or the center of attention sort of stuff, but he happens to be there, and he's seen so much. I mean, one of the first nights I went with him, we were in Brussels in Belgium, and there was Michael Allen, Tommy, and myself, and we sat down for dinner at the Sidewalk Cafe, and I think it was 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning when we decided to go back to our hotels and get some sleep. It was like a Monday or Tuesday night. It was just kind of a casual thing. But he's the kind of guy that knows so many people and has such good relationships with, frankly, megastars. But you wouldn't know it until he kind of comes up and introduces you to this guy. And, what did you do, Les? And he says, I started something called MTV. Oh, okay. Yeah, all right. That makes sense. And then Hollywood producers, Jerry Weintraub and things like that. He knew so many people, but they all considered him a close confidant and friend, and he never would name drop and never really, he was just there. I went to his 40th birthday party in Vegas, and they must have chartered a plane from L.A. to come over, because there was 150 people from L.A. that just wanted to come over and hang out with Tommy for his 40th. And he knew everybody, but I never saw him drunk. I've never seen him out of control whatsoever. He was just the cool guy at the table that, kind of nod his head, but he was. One night we're in Chicago, and he says, "What are you doing tonight?" And I said, "Well, I'm a little tired." I said, "Why? What's going on?" He says, "I'm going to go see the Stones. You want to come?" And I said, "Oh man, that sounds fantastic." And then he told me they were in Detroit.
How are we getting to Detroit, right?
He says, "Well, we'll drive to Detroit. We'll see the concert, and then we'll drive back." And I go, "No, I can't. I got to work in the morning. I know you can sleep till noon or 2 o'clock, but that, he had the ability with whoever it was with the Stones, offered him tickets and backstage passes, so he drove over to Detroit for the night, watch the concert, and turn around and come back."
It's I've always said dinner with TA is the most interesting experience, because you're exactly right. From the friendship I've had with him the last few years, is you never know who's going to be at the table, but it's always it's usually not golfers. Matter of fact, I don't know if I've ever sat down with another professional golfer at dinner with him in L.A. or Vegas, but it is a interesting conversation of really smart, fun. I mean, what a great conversation is that's the event of the night, is having dinner with that group of people. And I've been, I'm humbled by it and fortunate enough that I've been included on a few of these dinners, and it's great, right? It's just always such an interesting, eclectic group of people that, known him. Everyone seems to have known him for years, and he seems to keep those friends forever. The dinners have always just been, so much fun, and such interesting, smart people to meet in his circle. That's kind of what I've always just been amazed of, from artists to movie producers to an actor to, somebody in the restaurant business. And they're all there because Tom's in town, and, we're at Craig's having dinner back-to-back nights.
Yeah.
Why I'm at the table, hell, I don't have any idea.
No.
I shouldn't be, but I've wound up there a couple times. It's just fun. It's just fun to go out to dinner with him.
Yeah, and that's what I found more than anything, is just if I'm in the area and invited to come along, I just want to be the fly on the wall, because you weren't sure what was going to go down, but the group of eclectic people that he collected over the years, and that would just show up, and you go, really? Okay. How'd you meet him? And he's, well, back in the day, such and such, and they just stayed in touch. He was very good at staying in touch with, like, to this day, I haven't seen him since Houston, but, he'll probably call me tonight and ask how the podcast went, things like that. He's just interested in people and asks all the right questions. So,
yeah, he's a good dude. It's like I said, I'm grateful that I can call him a friend, and it's been fun to work with him too. He really knows the equipment, so I figured you had to have some good stories from TA over in Europe. But
well, there's no stories to tell because it was always quiet dinners, sort of thing,
No, that's what I mean. Those stories, right? Like that's what I've seen too, right? Like, but just like the stories of what an interesting night of who you might bump into. Not that it's crazy. I've never seen him crazy either. But it's always so fun and interesting, right? And that's where the story comes in, right? Mm-hmm. Like the people I've had to have dinner with, I never dreamt I'd sit at the table with that group of people. But it was fun. It's not like it's stuffy or it's bad or didn't feel comfortable at the table. Like we've had a blast all going out to dinner. And that's where I think the story gets interesting or it's fun to hang out with them.
I always appreciate being with or around superstar athletes and superstar actors. They seem to be a lot calmer than those that are trying to find the spotlight on the way up. When they're craving the spotlight, they do things to try and find the spotlight. But then when they get to this certain level, it's kind of low key. They don't want the spotlight. They want the personal space, and Tommy gives all of his friends the personal space. Let them be who they want to be, sort of thing, without putting on airs or whatever. And I think he makes everybody relaxed and finds or gravitates to those people where it's really a calm situation, not crazy at all.
Yes, I feel exactly the same way. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Hope you play well this afternoon on the golf course. And I would love to have we could, like I said, I could have gone 17 different directions with this. So I'd love to have the conversation again and, pick your brain on some other topics we could talk about rules of golf, how equipment's changed from that, what we could do going forward. So there's so many conversations, George, I could have with you. But, hopefully we can do it again in the future. But I truly enjoyed, this hour, and thanks so much for doing it.
Well, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it was all about Charles Barkley. And Barkley was talking about the owl factor. And I go, even for him, he, when you drop Charles's name, they say, who? That was his owl factor. He says, he's now in the owl factor. And I'm through that, I'm not recognized in the industry anymore. I've been out of it long enough where they've forgotten about me and moved on. So it's kind of interesting to be able to come back and tell and talk to some of the stories. And it's nice for me to go into the trailers and see the older guys that remember me, and we can reminisce on some of the stuff. But it's like me going to play golf this afternoon. I have zero expectations and know that ship has sailed. So it's nice to be able to reminisce on things like this and tell some stories. But that ship has sailed.
I agree that people love hearing this because you have so much history that you've seen, and then for me too, we're looking at some old things, especially on forged irons, that we're starting to look at, incorporate into our stuff a little bit every now and then, right? So it's so interesting to go deep dive back and, why did this work then? And can we use this and modernize it? So you have so much knowledge and history of, as long as you did it for, I think, there's a huge knowledge base you have where somebody like myself just tries to be a sponge and grab as much of it as I can, because we're always thinking of how can we, make our products better, and is there something we can grab from old and kind of reinvent, and there was a reason it was like that. And so for me, it's to be able to have you on my cell phone to call you, it's a wonderful resource. I so appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it, but I don't know if you've got the book yet. It's called The Clubmaker's Art. It's a coffee table book, and it basically has pictures and illustrations of every golf club I think ever invented. And I'll be honest with you, a man by the name of Sean Toulon, who runs Toulon Putters, he introduced me to this book back in the day, and I know through his design work at TaylorMade, he would go back through this book and try and look at different things like you're doing now. And, okay, let's modernize this particular golf club and try and figure it out, because there is nothing new in golf. It's a new look at it, but I mean, the original metalwood was made in like 1894 out of magnesium, and everybody thought TaylorMade invented it. No, it's been around in different forms for such a long period of time. So I think that's the cool thing about golf, is it continues to reinvent itself, modernize, and do different things.
And that's where it gets so, like, this is why I love designing and working with engineers and our tour staff and our good players and stuff like that. It's just so interesting to have the privilege to be able to do this for a living. I hope for me that never goes away, of how much I still just, I mean, I can't, working with Tommy and, like I said, some of the tour guys I've gotten to know, like, and how's this equipment perform? So, I'm like a 5-year-old still. I still just, I never had the talent to play professionally. This is what I get to do now, and it's, I always say, like, it's my, it's my major. Like, this is what I get to do, and you can learn a lot if you're open to it. Boy, there's a lot from, the modern technology. There's a lot that you can learn from the past, and if you listen, there's a lot you can learn just from feedback on stuff.
Yeah,
so
the creativity
it's so much fun.
Is the exciting part about it. Is what can we come up with, and how can we change this, and what if we do this, and so.
Exactly. Well, it's a privilege to have you on. Stay in contact, and like I said, I hope we can do it, sometime again.
I appreciate it.